people, that we could make laws ourselves, and he's going to explain about that, talk about that. And he's probably the main reason, certainly the main reason in Congress, that none of you are faced with a draft today. So,
women are applauding more than the men. That's interesting.
And Cynthia Boaz and Ken Burrows are the judges. We have 3 books. So the best questions today get a free autographed book from Mike. So and so they're our judge team. So he's going to talk a bit and then you can ask questions, have conversation. We just had lunch together, and he's very fun to talk with and kind of address him. So here's a person who's been at the highest levels of power in the U.S., and we'll tell you about that. Mike, thanks.
Thank you. I hope you don't mind if I sit down. It's more comfortable for me. In fact, as soon as I saw the chair, I jumped right on it. But I think you can all see me clearly, and my voice, I think, carries well enough in the back of the room. In addition to the Senate, I ran for president and debated Obama and Hillary in the presidential election in '07, and I was cut out after 7 debates in a conspiracy by the head of General Electric and the head of the Democratic Party. And they cut me out of the debates, and essentially all the rest of the media followed suit, and so it essentially made me a non-person. I then went to the Libertarians and tried to get them to adopt the National Initiative as part of their platform. I was not chagrined at all about not being the nominee, but when I was in the Senate, I was very much of a maverick, which means I was very libertarian and was not buying into the concept of parties. And I had been involved in politics all of my life from 15 years old. When I went to Alaska, I went there to run for office. I went to Alaska broke. 12 years later, I'm sitting in the United States Senate. In the meantime, I had become a state legislator. I was a speaker in Alaska. And not only that, when I say I started when I was 15, is I was always interested in public policy. And read a book, and I hope you'll write this down. I read a book by Emory Reeves, and it's called The Anatomy of Peace. The book was published in 1946. I was 16. I read it when I was 17, and it changed my life. It made me a globalist. And a lot of times when I was in the Senate, I would make speeches, and I would say at the end of my speech that I'm a citizen of the human race first, I'm an American second, I'm an Alaskan third, and my priorities are on that basis. And so I've never got carried away with, and I enlisted in the service during the Korean War, so I have my share of patriotism, but I never got carried away that my country was superior to all other countries, or that we as a people are superior to all other people. We're no different. We're all the same. We're all human beings. What we want is happiness. We want health. We want families. We want what's good for our children. So, starting with that, let me point out to you that where we stand today is that we're in a society where, and it's like the beginning of the Tale of Two Cities, we're in the best of the world, we're in the worst of the world. When you say the best, you can look at our advancement scientifically, and I was, of course, privileged to live through that before the computer came along, before all this electronics came along, and to live through and see this unbelievable change, which has empowered you from a productive point of view. And so science has moved forward at an unbelievable rate. And when you focus on a lot of things that are being done, it just is awesome, awesome. But at the same time, we developed the atomic energy, which we used, unfortunately, in the Second World War in a negative way. And then Dwight Eisenhower in mid-50s made a speech to the UN, which I attribute part of American guilt for using it to kill people. He made a speech called The Peaceful Atom. Well, that set in motion, which is a great statement, but unintended consequences. And the unintended consequence of us was real simple, that Eisenhower wanted to be able to use nuclear fission to generate power. When I first got elected in 1969, I opposed the nuclear testing that was taking place on an island in Amchitka on the Aleutian chain. And they had already detonated 3 nuclear devices and were going to detonate another one. And so I picketed the White House. I got essentially a global critique going in opposing this. In fact, a group of persons purchased a fishing boat in Vancouver to sail it out to the island and to protest it right on the site. They had to incorporate in order to limit their liability. The name of that corporation was Greenpeace, and that's how Greenpeace started, was with Amchitka Island. The detonation did take place. About several months after that, somebody in the Defense Department slipped me a memo, I don't recall who, but the memo essentially said that the testing that was going on in Alaska was for a nuclear warhead that was obsolete, which means he didn't have to go on with any more testing. I took this whistleblower's information and released it, and then that ended the testing in Alaska. So, touches of WikiLeaks today. For those of you that follow historically, I started to draft, and Peter was quite right. The young men here would be disposed of 2 years of your life, because that's what the draft was doing. And so I opposed the draft and was able to filibuster it, forcing it to do away with it. During that period of time, Dan Ellsberg got a hold of me and asked if I would read the Pentagon Papers in my course of my filibuster. How many of you know the Pentagon Papers? Raise your hand. Oh boy, okay, well, that's interesting. The Pentagon Papers was a study by Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, and he had come to believe that being in Vietnam was wrong. But he did nothing about it. But he wanted to figure out, since he's a very bright guy, so he's going to use taxpayer dollars to do a study as to how we got into Vietnam. And that was this study, about 7,000 pages. But then after he read it, he classified it top secret, and then he subsequently went on to because Lyndon Johnson got rid of him because he wasn't committed to the war sufficiently, and so put him over to the World Bank. Now, Daniel Ellsberg, who was part of the writing the Pentagon Papers, but also had been a Marine, was very gung-ho, went through a catharsis against the war. And since he had this knowledge of this study, he felt it was very important that the American people should see how we got into Vietnam. Because if it was important for McNamara to know how this mistake was done, it's even more important in a democracy for the people to know. So he couldn't get anybody in the Congress to take it up to release it. So he went to the New York Times and several other newspapers. They were then properly injunctured by the Nixon administration, not so properly in fact, that they couldn't publish. So he was stuck about late June that he couldn't get it out because every time a newspaper would publish a little bit, the government would stop. And so he, in the middle of my filibuster, and I was just a freshman at the time, he contacted me and said, would you release the Pentagon Papers? I said, of course I would. So the rest is history. The papers were released. At the time, I didn't think that it was going to have that much impact on the war. It did, because it changed public opinion ever so slightly. It brought about a change in the Congress and brought about a ratcheting down of the war. Now, as a result of that, Richard Nixon tried to get me indicted, and that took me all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, and this is what's interesting, the Supreme Court ruled in my case that I was free to give out any secrets that I wanted to as a senator. But the minute I moved off of my Senate role and tried to do it privately, then I would be subject to the risk of prosecution. The Supreme Court decision was 5-4, that I could release it as a senator, and the other 4 were saying I could release it as a senator and anywhere else. So essentially, it was a unanimous decision that, based upon the speech and debate clause of the Constitution, any member of Congress, and that's the law of the land today, any member of Congress could take any amount of information that's secret or otherwise and give it to the people. The whole principle is very simple. If you, in a democracy, are to be able to have to influence public policy, you have to know what the heck your government's doing. Now, how many of you knew that our government had rendition sites where we would grab people, take them to Egypt, take them to wherever, and get them tortured? How did we find out about that? This was a whistleblower inside of the CIA who subsequently got fired. And that's how we found out that our government was absolutely doing immoral things in your name. So you begin to see there's an experience with Durbin, Senator Durbin from, who's the whip in the Senate, from Illinois. About 3 years ago, he came out with a statement because he felt very bad about what had happened. He was on the Intelligence Committee. And so the Intelligence Committee was being briefed. This is in the lead up to the war in Iraq. They were being briefed on one set of facts, and Bush and Cheney were releasing facts to the public which did not match what they were being briefed on. Now at the time, he felt that maybe as a senator, he should say something. But he had second thoughts. Said, well, somebody may get killed or die if I say something. Well, so he said nothing. And 4,400 Americans died because he said nothing. Because had he said something, he might have stopped the resolution passing that would give Bush the power to go into Iraq. That's the dynamic